In part two of our look at migration, we're going to focus on immigration. And remember, the difference between migration and immigration is that immigration includes the permanent move over an international boundary. So basically moving to a new country. And our focus in part two is really going to be heavily based on the United States immigration history. The graphic on your screen now shows you two things: the percentage of the population that is foreign born, and also the total foreign born population, which is the red line that shows us the number in millions of Americans that were born in other countries. You'll notice a couple trends here. One, the blue line, the percentage of foreign born, isn't as high as it was in the past, isn't as high as it was in the first quarter of the 1900s. We're at about 13-14% today. But you'll notice that as our population grows, the total number of foreign born Americans has increased to an all-time high. You'll see a pretty marked decline in the percentage that occurred between 1930 and 1970, and we'll investigate why that happened and why we've seen this increase over the last generation or so. When we look at immigration as part of the global population, we're looking at only about 3%. 3% of the 7.5 to 8 billion people on Earth are really immigrants. And the United States is a bit of a unique case because our population history has relied heavily on immigration. A quote from the readings that immigration is the raw material of cultural globalization. Again, meaning that as people move around from country to country, place to place, they bring their culture with them, and as they interact with others, they recreate a new culture. This idea of polyculturalism or syncretism. The image on your screen is taken from East Lombard Street in Baltimore City in the early 1900s. A large Jewish population moved into this neighborhood, and as you can see from the signs that you have script in both Hebrew and English, reflecting the local owner. So as the Jewish community moved into East Baltimore, it brought with it different recipes, different businesses, different ways of life that ultimately assimilated, merged, syncretized with the existing culture. When we talk about the people that are immigrating in the previous lecture, the previous part of this lecture, we looked at migration selectivity. Today's immigrants carry with them a number of characteristics. One, they're younger. So again, 18 to 30 generally reflects a higher likelihood that you'll migrate, and the immigrants of the United States today reflect that. Our immigrants are more educated. Our immigrants are arriving more often than not for economic reasons. While we do have certain refugees that are fleeing political violence or economic collapse or natural disasters, jobs are generally why people are arriving in the United States. And what we're seeing with our immigrants today is a bit of a unique scenario where we have what's called a bipolar distribution. So if we look at average levels of income and average levels of educational achievement, we see that we have our immigrants at the top, but we also have a number at the bottom. We're kind of missing the American average, the American middle overall, when we include both our native-born population and our foreign-born population. So this bipolar distribution is something to keep an eye on, not only for economic opportunities, but we also see certain issues with discrimination with some of our immigrants that fall into the lower end of education or economic achievement. Cultural landscapes, key theme to this course, are impacted by these migration streams. On your screen right now at the top you see Chinatown in Lower Manhattan. Chinatown is a Chinese enclave dating back to the 19th century where Chinese communities, Chinese immigrants arrived here and they brought with them their culture, and you could see that in the signage. You could see that the script in this neighborhood isn't English, it is Chinese. On the bottom you see the migration streams from the Alan Marcus article. On the bottom left image, you see a Brazilian steakhouse. You see a Brazilian restaurant that opened up in the United States that reflects the migration stream. On the bottom right, you see a Stop and Shop located in Brazil. Stop and Shop is a large grocery store chain in Massachusetts where the American end of one of the migration streams has evolved. So moving along that stream, we also see ideas, restaurants, businesses, brands go back to Brazil. This idea of syncretism is strong in both of these communities. And we also see a population that has been voluntarily segregated in Chinatown for generations. Early on, that segregation was involuntary, but as laws were removed in the late 1800s and going into the mid 1900s, that community remained segregated, self-segregated, because of a history of discrimination and forced segregation. The images on the bottom reflect voluntary segregation that's occurring in Brazilian communities in the United States. We've long held mixed reactions to immigration in the United States, both positive and negative, regardless of the time. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the immigration rhetoric today, both for and against allowing immigrants to enter the United States. The image on your screen right now is a bit of satire reflecting a long ago time when people started arriving in North America. The idea that the American Indians, the native populations here, couldn't have perhaps not welcomed our early English arrivers. When we look at immigration, when we look at the reaction to immigration, a lot of that is dictated by policies. So do we have do we have an administration in Washington, D.C. that is more or less welcoming to immigrants arriving in the United States? And we see these policies influence public rhetoric. Are people xenophobic or afraid of outsiders coming in? Or do we have a national movement that is geared more towards embracing immigrants? And we will never find 100% xenophobic or 100% embracing, but we do find general movements, general trends where xenophobia is either escalated in the dominant voice or embracing immigrants is the dominant voice. List some examples here. Two examples that are very much xenophobic. President Hoover in the 1920s was part of a movement that eventually led to a very strict immigration policy, something that we'll visit here shortly, when he referred to his Italians as murderers and bootleggers. More recently, then candidate Donald Trump referred to immigrants coming over the southern border as drug dealers, rapists, and killers. Again, this type of rhetoric, this xenophobia, infiltrates through the general population. While not everybody is xenophobic or everybody is embracing, it does influence millions of people and how they think when they see the administration in Washington, D.C. say these kind of things. Both of these candidates are from the Republican Party, and we're going to look at examples of Republican Party presidents that were also embracing. So when I throw out these quotes, I'm not looking for anybody to pick political parties or sides. I want to show that even within the same political party, the rhetoric could be different. These words by President Woodrow Wilson, who was a president before Herbert Hoover, looked at the value that immigrants could bring to the United States. Again, this doesn't mean that everybody was embracing of immigrants at the time, but the political position in Washington was one of welcoming people. And more recently, George W. Bush, who was the president in the early 21st century, also had some kinder words, some more embracing words about people arriving here in the United States. And feel free to pause and review the 4 quotes listed here, the 2 for embracing and the 2 that reflected more of a xenophobic view. Part 3, we're going to look at the waves of immigration in the United States. And these waves are very important to our current demographics, our current population today in the U.S. This infographic is included in an article that's posted to Blackboard. This could be a little bit difficult to digest right away, so if you want to pause the video at this point and take some time to look through the colors and how they line up to the countries, you may find that beneficial. We're going to go through different phases of migration and look individually at the different colors and the different countries that align and the different times, but you may want to pause right now, digest this image, and you could also open the link in Blackboard for the article that holds this image. But give yourself some time to see what this is saying before we jump in to analyzing these different waves. The waves that we're going to explore include the colonial period, the old wave, the new wave, a period known as the Great Migration, which corresponded to internal U.S. migration when we limited immigrants coming from other parts of the world. And then our most recent wave is called the ethnic kaleidoscope. You'll see how the colors change over time. What that's basically telling you is that the countries involved in U.S. immigration have changed. You'll see how expansion occurred and then contraction, particularly the expansion of the new wave, the contraction during the Great Migration, and then the expansion of the ethnic kaleidoscope. The colonial period was a time from the start of the country through 1820. Basically looking at immigrants arriving in the United States when the U.S. was still a colony back in the 1600s through 1820. And the colonial period represented people coming from Western Europe and also slaves. So we saw a time of voluntary and involuntary migration. When we look at the population, in addition to slaves coming primarily from West Africa, we saw British, French, Swedish, and Dutch outposts. So these outposts established migration streams, something that we touched on briefly before and something that's also well analyzed in the Alan Marcus article. These migration streams or outposts facilitated the movement of individuals from England, from France, from Sweden, and from the Netherlands arriving on the East Coast in the United States. The population was relatively homogeneous during this period, as it was 95% rural Protestants. So we had a population that was pre-urban, a population based primarily in small towns and agriculture. The voluntary group coming from those 4 European nations, and the involuntary group coming from West Africa and supporting the agricultural economy, providing that free labor for the early period. The image on your screen is of Baltimore in 1815, and you could see how undeveloped the city was at that time. A few neighborhoods that you may be familiar with today, Fells Point, Jonestown, Inner Harbor, those were all present at the time, but the city itself was very small in size and also population. Our second period is called the Old Wave, which occurred between 1820 and 1880, a time period that crossed the Civil War and also included the urbanization and industrialization of the United States. So groups during this wave continued to come from the UK, continued to come from France, Sweden, and the Netherlands, but we saw other countries, such as Germany and Ireland, begin to contribute to the immigration flow. We saw a considerable rural to urban movement as rural opportunities in places like Ireland and Germany were falling apart, and they found opportunity in American cities. What was met with concern during this period of immigration was that Catholics, primarily Irish, and much of the German immigrant population were Catholics. And the arrival of Catholics was seen as a threat. This group was different. There was a feared allegiance to the Pope and the Vatican, and that these were not true Americans. They would never embrace, they would never become fully American. This type of rhetoric you may be familiar with today with our new groups coming in. Catholicism isn't likely the area of concern, but there's other cultural practices that people today are concerned with. This image, coming from a political party in Maryland called the Know Nothing Party, reflects a lot of that animosity towards outsiders. Native Americans, beware of foreign influence. The idea that Irish and German immigrants are political and cultural threats to the United States. This image, coming from a newspaper in the mid-1800s, shows a very negative depiction of Irish and German immigrants. The idea that these immigrants could help sway or steal or rig elections, and that the Irish populations are whiskey drinkers, and that the German population are beer drinkers, and that they're not to be trusted. So again, think about how this type of rhetoric has persisted in the United States from this time up to today. When we look at the idea surrounding immigration and the laws surrounding immigration, back at this point, the only requirement was don't be sick. The 2 areas circled here, the first is Fells Point, was the immigration terminal. The bottom was Lazaretto Point. Lazaretto is an Italian word for sick hospital or sick ward. Individuals would be checked at Lazaretto Point. If they were healthy, they'd move on. If they weren't, they would be isolated, and many of them died in what is modern day Canada, the modern day Canton Industrial Park. So again, requirements during this area were lax, rhetoric was strong, and we had millions of people flooding